I think for me, the hardest call I went on was when it was June of 2012. And I don't know if you guys know Selena Hollis. She was the Denver officer that was killed. We were in the academy together and we worked together. We worked at the same district. And so that's the hardest when you're out on another call and you hear that there's an officer involved shooting, and then you hear that an officer was hit, and then all the radio chatter on your way on being hit is probably the toughest.
The female that was coming out of the bathroom at the time, coming out of the shower wet, was burned head to toe. And she looked over at me right away and says, "I know who you are." And I couldn't recognize who the person was. She unfortunately did not survive, and it wasn't until weeks later that it came out and I seen the picture and knew who it was.
The big ones in short order. I had a lieutenant that was killed off duty. Within probably a week or two, we had a pediatric stabbing. Probably a week after that, we had a pit bull mauling. And then it was pretty quiet for a while.
While the numbers of PTSD are much higher among emergency responders than they are the general population, the far greater number, the thing that impacts most emergency responders, is a cumulative career traumatic stress. So it's not the big calls, it's not necessarily the school shootings, it's the repeated exposure to these smaller scale quote-unquote traumas that often lead to the negative impact on responders' lives.
It has been a great time for the military to finally be bringing the PTSD and a lot of the issues that they're struggling with. The statistic, 22 veterans a day are no longer living because of the struggles that they're dealing with. It's hard to quantify the emergency services, how many people are lost in this line of work.
We have a lot of studies in PTSD from the military, but there are some significant differences between the military and public safety. For instance, when the military goes to a hostile zone, they do their job and eventually they leave. They go home, typically to a different country. Okay, public safety lives in the community typically in which they work, so they can't necessarily get away. And it's only honestly since September 11th that we've had good studies in PTSD and the stresses for first responders.
With our community, I have employees that have PTSD that have to respond to military folks that have it. And that's really, really, really difficult to deal with.
When you're trying to prevent PTSD, you're trying to move those events to your memory centers. But what a lot of responders don't realize is whatever they see, they can never unsee. Whatever they hear, they can never unhear. And when you're in this field for a long time, you get what we call the Book of the Dead. And every event you cover is in a page in that book. And even though you process the trauma, there will be times that you'll wake up the Book of the Dead. And we'll have first responders saying, "Oh man, I thought I dealt with that." And then they're freaking out thinking they didn't. You dealt with it, you just woke up the ghost.
Even though the ghosts stick with you, it's not something that has to affect you for the rest of your career, and it's not something that says you need to leave the job because you have experienced post-traumatic stress or even post-traumatic injury is what we're really trying to lead the people into believing about post-traumatic stress, that it's an injury, not a disorder. It can heal. You're still gonna have the scar, but the scar's not gonna hurt.
This profession, you're gonna be traumatized. I don't care who you are. We go into some really jacked up situations and see some pretty jacked up things, and we have to just put everything on hold and do our job. And if we can't reconnect and try to process what the heck just happened and heal from it or accept it or reject it or whatever we choose to do, it's just gonna build up a wall, and that's gonna fester inside.
We are the ones that fix problems. That's why people call 911, is because they have a problem that they can no longer handle. And our job is to show up and fix those problems. But after a time, that chips away at anybody. And whether we admit it or not, it affects us. Even our dispatchers, they're in a sensory deprivation chamber where all they can do is hear what's going on through the phone. They can't actually get there and physically help a person that's choking or that is going through a crisis at the time.
Friends and loved ones don't really understand why these changes have taken place, why there seems to be a growing darkness. When they're sharing a gruesome scene and then they see the horror on people's faces, that was unintended, they weren't doing that, but to them it's normal, and it's part of how they're dealing with it, but they learn that other people can't handle that. That sometimes happens in the families also.
My two oldest are boys, so I don't think they necessarily see, it just is what it is. My wife doesn't like it anymore at all. It's an issue right now, but
You'll hear families saying, I just need you to talk to me about what you went through, because talking is good. But then as the first responder starts to talk, he or she realizes I'm traumatizing my family member. So part of what we tell family members is, careful what you ask for, because if you're asking for details and that's traumatizing you, that's going to make it worse on both of you. So have rules of engagement in terms of what you can tolerate and what you can't, because trauma's contagious. You can pass it on to somebody else.
We don't want to hurt other people with our stories. When we talk about our stories, if we see that it's hurting the counselor, we'll shut up. Okay? Same with family members, same with anybody.
The way the EMS society is, you're taught to suck it up and deal with it and move on kind of deal, and there's some calls you can't do that.
I honestly believe that there is something that can happen to the human brain that happened to my brain when you can no longer understand or grasp the horrors of the world, the horrors that a human being can do to another human being. And that there's a point that you can get to where your body and your mind just tell you no more. Enough is enough. And that's what happened to me. And the symptomology of that was I began experiencing pretty horrific night terrors. I was having panic attacks, very, very bad anxiety all the time. And it affected every facet of my personal and my professional life, to the point where I began abusing alcohol as a means of trying to calm myself. I was just a cop who chose this mechanism to cope, and it got out of control, and it almost killed me.
I had some traumatic events happen to me when I was younger that I never dealt with, but I was able to function and I was able to be a functioning member of society and perform my job. But this job added a bunch of other new traumas on top of some of the old stuff that I'd never dealt with. And then that was one of the main reasons why I was drinking, was to try to cope with things that had happened in the past and things that are happening as we speak, sort of thing.
We're all type A, macho, you don't want to think you have issues. And sometimes you go pretty far before you realize that maybe you need to talk to somebody. But they are out there.
And I mean, it got to the point I almost lost my job because of it. Because it was eating me up, but I didn't realize it. They forced me to go to counseling, actually. They said, hey, here's the deal, here's 2 weeks off, you're gonna go to counseling. And so I went, and it actually was one of the best things that I did.
I always thought of those things as it's out here. I got this stuff, and it's stuff, but it's part of the job. That stuff's out there for other people that have bigger issues, right? My issues aren't that big. Other people have bigger issues. So it's there, knowing what is going to be your thing. I think it's just a work in progress.
Resiliency is a set of skills that are protective factors, that are an immunization, if you will, against what life will throw at you, especially in the first responder world. So if you have exposure and you have high enough antibodies built up in your body and the analogy with the immune system, as far as resiliency skills and you're practicing those, what life throws at you, you'll be more protected against depression, anxiety, or PTSD.
I believe most of the leaders understand the importance of taking care of their employees. I believe that there needs to be more emphasis on actually taking action, not just the words, but the actions into taking care of the mental health of the employees as well as their families.
The definition I use for resiliency goes back to Darwin's survival of the fittest. It doesn't go to the smartest or the fastest or the strongest, but it goes to the species that adapts the quickest. So resilient people, instead of saying, this shouldn't be bothering me, they'll say, hey, this bothers me, I need to do something about it. And instead of saying, I should be able to handle this on my own, they say, I'm going to do whatever it takes.
Within the Denver Fire Department, we realize that just as diverse as the people are, the support services there need to be as diverse. And so right now on the fire department, you can reach out in a multitude of different ways. You may feel comfortable reaching out through chaplaincy, and we have that available. You may feel comfortable sitting down with a trained psychologist, and we make that available. We also have peer support for those that really don't want to go to a psychologist, don't want to talk to a chaplain, but just want to talk to their peers. And so we're continuing looking to see what other avenues are there.
Education is a very important pre-event, and that's where the department sets up training and awareness for folks of here's what you're going to get into. Then you got an event where the individual's in the middle of it, and that's where you look at, okay, what can we do to limit the exposure? Like, the wellness checks and things like that, or giving them breaks or pulling them from front lines to rear lines. Then you have the post-event, and then post-event is how do you get the yuck out of you? And that's setting up the debriefings and setting up purging and setting up how do you get balance back in your life, because if all you're seeing is death, you get a pretty weird perspective of life.
You definitely need to find an out, whether it's talking to someone or getting therapy, not drugs or alcohol or going home and yelling at everybody, but at least be able to talk about it. And when you get past that, when you get it out and it's no longer, you're not the only person who's feeling what you're feeling, it's actually very rewarding.
Get a happy place that you can bring to work with you, so that when you do take that tough call, in between calls, you can go to that happy place and kind of remind yourself that it is not just crap all the time, that there's good stuff in the world. There's a reason you're doing this. There's a reason you signed up to do this. You can break it up and remind yourself of the outside world while you're in here.
Keep that relationship, keep it a two-way street with your children. It's easy for them to take on that blame and believe that they're the ones that's causing the issue. Children can be a first responder's lifeline back. And that's what Rebecca was for me.